Hi, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to the France 24 debate. A crisis is a terrible thing to waste. That overused line was 2008's motto when the global financial system teetered. Since then, well, the world's become even more interconnected, and flagrant imbalances and inequalities have grown, not shrunk. Now, with COVID-19, the planet's got an even bigger fire to put out. A decade after the Great Recession, how to prevent a remake of a Great Depression, how to avoid the mistakes of 2008, how to turn this crisis into an opportunity to review our priorities, our way of doing business, and the role of citizens and governments alike. Joining us, he's the former Greek finance minister at the height of that country's cash crisis, Yanis Varoufakis, today member of the Greek parliament. Thank you for joining us from Aegina. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Absolutely.
All right, Aegina, just outside of Athens.
Yes, indeed.
Where you're confined still for the time being.
Yes, except when I have to go to Parliament, because our Parliament, in the infinite wisdom of its presidency, has failed to provide teleconferencing, but we are trying to convince them.
All right. There's 1 week to go, and I'm sure Jean-Claude Trichet, the former president of the European Central Bank, is counting down the days before France ends its full lockdown. Thank you for joining us from Paris.
It's a pleasure, a real pleasure. I am at home, you see, confined.
And you're staying home. Okay, great. Joining us from Suffolk, Ann Pettifor, economist, co-founder of Jubilee 2000, and the author of The Case for the Green New Deal. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
When is the beginning of deconfinement where you are?
We haven't been told yet, but I suspect it's a week or so ahead.
A week or so ahead. Okay, hang in there. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Let's begin with the day's news. This Monday, an EU-led online fundraising event is taking place. It aims to raise $7.5 billion for vaccines, medicines, and diagnoses to be developed for the coronavirus and made available around the world. Jean-Claude Trichet, a laudable effort. At the same time, the fact that you have to hold a telethon highlights the fact that there is no Europe-wide health policy. It's done on a nation-by-nation basis. What are your thoughts when you see that the EU is, well, some might say, reduced to running telethons?
Yeah, well, I mean, the problem is that everybody is confined. So it's not abnormal that it is a video conference. By the way, it's not only a European one. It is a European initiative calling the rest of the world to step in. And it demonstrates clearly, I think it's a very laudable initiative of the European. I also think that it is only possible because there is no leadership at the global level. There is no multilateral spirit. And we are living in a world which I have to say is very much out of Europe, a world of national populism. All over the world, frankly speaking, including the major emerging economies. When you look at India, when you look at Russia, when you look at Turkey, Brazil, you see the same kind of national populism, which is not keen on, I would say, global multilateral management, which is very, very dramatically lacking at the present moment.
Yanis Varoufakis, you agree that this is a sign of strength, the European Union trying to step into the vacuum and do something on a planetary scale?
My sentiments are closer to the essence of your question. I consider this to be yet another demonstration of the lack of a European Union. It is a declaration of defeat when, as you put it, we have to indulge in telethons in order to gather a few meager billions in order to fund that which is necessary across Europe and the world. I agree with Jean-Claude that we live in a very perilous world where multilateralism has collapsed, where we have antagonism between the United States and China, where the three major economic blocs are failing to cooperate. They were before coronavirus hit, they still are, and I very much fear they will fail to coordinate afterwards. But Europe, because we have a union, supposedly, should be at the forefront of coordinated collective decision-making, that if we can have a central bank that Jean-Claude Trichet knows very well, that can print hundreds of billions of euros on behalf of the financial system, surely we could put our minds together and be solidaristic with Europeans, with those who are suffering mostly in Italy, in Spain, in other countries, and with the rest of the world. The fact that we have a European Commission that is effectively penniless in proportion to the total GDP of the European Union is a sign of failure.
To be fair, that is the point that the new president of the European Commission has been making when she's calling for a much bigger budget for the European Commission, and she is saying that that's the way to go in order to have more teeth in the EU policy when it comes to matters such as health.
Well, very briefly, what the euro crisis has done since 2010, it has very seriously depleted the authority and the power of the European Commission. Once upon a time, under Jacques Delors, the European Commission was powerful. It was strong. It looked like the government of Europe. But with the first bailouts of countries like Greece, Portugal, and so on, balance of part of the European Commission towards the shadowy Troika, and the European Commission has been diminished as an institution. Its budget has fallen behind. Brexit has not helped much. And now we are failing to rise up to the occasion that the coronavirus crisis is creating for us.
All right, let's bring in Ann Pettifor on this. And yes, since 2008, we've had Brexit, rise of populism. When you see the response today and the potential response to come, what are the lessons you've learned?
Well, first of all, the first point is this, is that, when the crisis hit and trillions of dollars had to be raised to bail out Wall Street, the City of London and Frankfurt, nobody went round with a tin asking for charity and for help. There was a monetary system that worked in the United States' case closely with fiscal policy. Monetary and fiscal policy worked in tandem to provide resources both for Wall Street but also for Main Street. And that is the problem here, that we have to go around with a begging tin to raise the money to finance this very, very important vaccine. But another point is this, is that the vaccine is going to be developed by private companies who are going to use the opportunity to, milk this crisis for all it's worth. And again, we come back to, why don't we have public health systems? Why don't we have public health systems that could provide vital vaccines to the population and provide the security that the population needs? As to the role of Europe, I think what it is revealing is, we know, and Jean-Claude Trichet is quite right, that there is a vacuum of political leadership, a very deliberate vacuum of political leadership. In my view, it's a reaction to globalization. The rise of nationalism, as Karl Polanyi argued, is a reaction, is a protection that people demand from their political leaders, from government by market forces. And so we get the rise of nationalism as a consequence of globalization. But equally, we get the rise of for authoritarian protectionist leaders who can't act and who cannot act in a leadership role. And this is where Europe would be so important. Europe is fundamentally not the United States, and it's not China. It could play a progressive role in the global economy. It could be a leader, but unfortunately, it insists on constantly falling apart, and it insists on a bifurcation between monetary and fiscal policy, which is so absolutely damaging to the health of the European economy.
So Jean-Claude Trichet, what's the key to avoiding a repeat of some of the mistakes of 2008?
First of all, I think we should not confuse the financing of the medicine and the vaccine to fight against the virus and the general mobilization of fiscal weaponry and monetary weaponry in order to cope with the real economic crisis and the financial crisis, which is looming and creates a lot of hardship for our fellow citizens. You have two things. I praise Europe for the initiative which has been taken when the US is mute, when China is mute, and then we say, let's find out 7.5 billion euros to finance the vaccine and to finance the medicine. I think we should, the three of us should praise Europe for taking this initiative. Now, of course, we have a lot of things to do, other things to do. What I observed myself after the previous crisis in 08, 09, 10, 11, and so forth, I observed that the over-indebtedness of the world has continued to augment considerably. So when this crisis, which had nothing to do at the beginning with the finance or real economy, but when it started, we were in a very weak position because of this over-indebtedness. And we have certainly in the future to have a better understanding of what we need, all of you. But again, on Europe, don't forget, Europe is not under the hands of national populist leaders. On the contrary, it calls for multilateralism being effective and efficient. And I think, again, we should all praise Europe for that.
And Yanis Varoufakis was bemoaning the fact that Europe projected more strength in the past than it does today. You have the president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Trichet, who is calling for a bigger EU budget at this time. Is that the way to go?
I think there is a decision in principle to go along this call of Ursula von der Leyen. I think that the problem we have at the present moment is how to finance that. She even said we would need over Europe something like €1 trillion. So we'll see what happens. The problem is that it is blocked because there is no agreement at the moment I'm speaking on how to finance that, whether it would be with Eurobonds, Corona bonds, and so forth. I am personally in favor of the Eurobonds because it goes in the direction of a more federal Europe, which we are badly in need of, in my opinion. That being said, what counts is to mobilize the weaponry and be able to deal with the present dramatic circumstances. So I would say, if it goes through the budget of the Commission, okay, let's go. Let's decide as soon as possible.
So I would also agree, and I would praise the European Union for this initiative. Indeed, I would go further and do something unusual for me, and I would praise President Macron for recently saying that the mode of globalization makes multilateralism so difficult. We can't have multilateralism in a world of globalization. Globalization is about capital markets dictating policy, interest rate policy, exchange rate policy. That is what globalization is about. So when President Macron said quite recently that he felt that the strains of climate change and weakening democracy were the result of the established mode of globalization, he called it, and that even that what we now need is a new grammar of multilateralism, but we cannot have that in a globalized world. And that's, I think, and in a world, by the way, which is governed by the dollar, in which the global dollar system is dominant, and part of the reason, and here again I have to agree with Mr. Trichet, that actually, European convergence and integration is, in my view, really important from the perspective of challenging the global dollar system, which is so unfair and so unbalances the global economy.
Before I turn to Yanis Varoufakis, Jean-Claude Trichet, a word on that. As a former president of the European Central Bank, should the leadership of the dollar be challenged, particularly when it comes right now with what we're seeing on commodity markets, with most notably the price of oil going through the floor?
So the main problem with the dollar, of course, is very much that it is utilized often as a political weapon. And we could see that in Europe when we had a disagreement with the US on Iran. And the fact that the dollar was utilized against us because we were following the previous treaty and the US had decided to reject the previous treaty. But all being said, I would again say it depends on what you say and what is behind the word globalization. In my opinion, there is a good globalization a better globalization, a much better globalization, but we cannot reject the fact that we are in a single planet. We cannot reject the fact that we are human beings and prone to the same viruses. So we are very, very much very close together. I mean, and of course, I take it that we have to change our management of globalization in many dimensions in order for it to be sustainable in the very long run.
Yanis Varoufakis, you agree?
Well, I couldn't disagree more. Because globalization is not about internationalism. Globalization is the opposite of internationalism. I am an internationalist. I want this planet to behave rationally. And I want us, if not to have a world government, but to coordinate fully. But globalization has never been about internationalism. It's been about the right of capital, of money, to free movement and to have complete power over the real economy, while people live behind walls and there is no real freedom of movement for common folks. That was the model of globalization that crashed and burned in 2008, and whose crisis we are still suffering, and whose crisis has created the kind of depravity and precariousness that made the world so fragile just before the coronavirus hit. But allow me to make a point about Europe. I am a very proud European, but I do seriously believe that it is a mistake to enter into self-congratulatory mode about Europe now. Europe has failed itself and the world over the last few weeks. Jean-Claude, you were quite right. We do need the coronavirus. We need a Eurobond. We need all the things you said. But they have, our great leaders in the last few weeks, they have completely and utterly wasted this crisis opportunity as an opportunity to bring them about. They've killed off the coronavirus and the Eurobond. It's finished. It's dead in the water. There's no point in pretending that it's still even on the negotiation table. And allow me to make this very simple.
Hang on a sec, Yanis Varoufakis. You've been there in the room at negotiations when you have all these Eurozone finance ministers huddled together in the same room. It's a long process. It's complicated. It takes a while to get a deal.
I'm sorry. Look, it's crucial at this point that we do not mislead our audience. Our audience needs to know that our leaders, President Macron being foremost in this, have sacrificed the Eurobond. It is dead in the water. This crisis was a fantastic opportunity to put it on the table. They put it on the table by means of a letter, but in the first Eurogroup meeting, which concluded after several meetings that failed on the 9th of April, by accepting that Italy, for instance, that has been so badly hit both at the medical level and at the level of the economic crisis, given its great indebtedness, it's of course a frontline state in the fight to save the Eurozone, fight to save the European Union. That was the moment for the finance minister of Holland, of Germany, and so on, to come to terms with the idea of a Eurobond. They didn't. Instead, they managed to veto the Eurobond, and President Macron completely surrendered to that. And what have they decided instead? Loans from the European Stability Mechanism through quantitative easing. So effectively, the Eurobond idea, which is...
Again, on that point, Ursula von der Leyen telling France 24 last Friday that there's still arbitration going on over whether or not it's going to be loans or grants.
There is no arbitration going on. It's been sold out. It is finished.
No.
The government of France and Italy are pretending that it is still on the table. It is not. Because once they've decided that the rise in debt as a result of this crisis is going to fall on the shoulders of the budget of the nation states, this is it. We had a moment in exactly the same way that President Obama had a window of opportunity of 6 months after 2008 in order to restructure Wall Street. He didn't use it. It went and passed forever. We have missed the chance of a Eurobond. The only way President Macron can bring it back is by vetoing everything that comes to the European Union Council from now on that does not involve a Eurobond for funding the recovery fund. He's not going to do it. Already they have agreed that this is disgraceful what they've agreed. They've agreed that the recovery fund, which they are talking about $1 trillion, is going to be based on what? On guarantees provided by member states to the tune of 0.6% of GDP, something like 250 billion. Guarantees, not money, that goes to the European Commission, so the European Commission can use those guarantees to borrow in the money markets.
Yeah.
Now, that is not a Eurobond.
Jean-Claude Trichet, has the moment passed?
No,
Is it
no.
too late?
First of all, we should not confuse everything. Corona bond would be borrowing, and so the counterpart would be loan. And the various countries issuing the various treasuries would be joint and several in guaranteeing these Corona bonds. So I agree with the concept, but we should not say that it is totally different from what Ursula could do with the possibility of herself, for the sake of the full European Union, borrowing and then helping the countries that need help. So I don't agree on the fact that it's a total failure. It's another way. And again, I agree with you because I am in favor of the Corona bonds. But we should not, throw the baby with the bathwater. No, let's be frank. And on globalization, let me only say that if poverty has been fought against in China very successfully, if poverty is fought all over Asia quite successfully, it's also because there was some kind of link at the level of the planet. So it has to be improved considerably. It has to be rearranged. It has to be sustainable. But to say that it was only in favor of the wealthiest country is wrong. After World War II, the US had half of the GDP of the world. Today, the full body of the G7 represents only less than 30% of the GDP of the world, and it will continue to shrink. So let's accept that there are liabilities, a lot of them, and also some assets in what has been done over the last 30, 40 years. But I agree that we have to improve a lot.
Ann Pettifor, a lot of people watching us. Just let me bring in Ann Pettifor on this. A lot of people watching us.
The globalization was rejected by China. This is why China was such a great success, because it did not end capital controls. It did not do as the IMF and the World Bank were telling them. It did not follow the playbook of globalization.
And the technology of the rest of the world did not count, and the exports of China did not count. And again,
but it did not play to the playbook of globalization.
We have to accept that it is more complex.
And Pettifor, sitting on your side of the channel, you're listening to this exchange about, the interdependence of the world. What's going through your mind?
Well, precisely that we're, that Yanis is absolutely right. We are internationalists. China has to trade, and nobody would say, no, Yanis would not argue, I will not argue that international trade is not a good thing and helps increase their GDP. That is not the point. The point is, do unfettered cross-border capital flows ensure A, economic stability, financial stability, and secondly, do they actually exaggerate the rise of nationalism, authoritarianism, protectionism, and fascism even? And they do, because we know that from the experience of Europe in the 1920s and 30s. It's precisely because of the gold standard. And let's face it, today, Europe is living under a new gold standard, and the world is living under a new gold standard, which is the monetary system is in the hands of the private sector, in the hands of Wall Street, the City of London, and Frankfurt. Now, here in Britain, we've put up our nationalist barriers, we've put up our protectionist barriers, we've taken back control, apparently, but not from the international capital markets. They still determine the value of our currency, the rate of interest, whether or not finance is raised, whether or not finance comes in or leaves. So, it's the power of mobile capital, private mobile capital. And I say this again, right now, the low-income countries have been sacrificed on the crucifix of the dollar because private investors, creditors, and speculators stampeded out of low-income countries and straight towards the dollar, which strengthened the dollar, crashed their currencies, increased their borrowing costs, and at a time when they were dealing with the plague, right? And we sit back here and we say, well, that's been good for them. It has.
Okay, so we're looking here at the present and at the future, Ann Pettifor.
Yeah.
There is the cost of borrowing that you mentioned. Who controls financial flows? Yes. The other question is, and we're seeing it right now, the French government, for instance, is propping up those who are temporarily laid off. It can't last forever without the economy restarting. At the end of the day, the question is, who pays for the recovery?
It's a very straightforward answer. There is only one, well, there's four ways to pay for the recovery. We can default on the debt, we can refuse to pay it, we can write it off. But the best way is to create jobs, generate income, and repay those debts. The best way to balance the budget, as Keynes very carefully argued, you don't balance the nation's budget or the European Union's budget by cutting the Europeans' income. You raise their income. You ensure that you employ people and you employ them at decent wages. You make sure that they're skilled. You upgrade those jobs, but above all, you upgrade income. You make sure that people earn more. What this crisis has taught us is that actually we can manage very well without highly paid footballers, but we cannot manage without delivery drivers or cleaners or nurses, and they are all low paid. Their incomes have very deliberately been repressed over austerity. And as a result, the European budgets have never been fixed since the crisis, and they won't be fixed. The way to fix the post-crisis budget is to increase employment in Europe, across the whole of Europe, including Italy, Spain, and Greece. And to ensure that those people who are fundamental to the functioning of the economy are paid decent wages. That way, the budget will get balanced. People will have higher incomes. They'll pay more tax revenues, and pretty quickly we'll solve the budget, just as we did here in Britain post-war. You know,
Jean-Claude Trichet, you agree that when this is all over, we'll be paying essential workers more than we are today?
We should.
I mean, what we would need is demand to be there again. The main problem we have is that we are not sure that our economy will function as they did before in terms of volume of demand. And I am like Anne, I am very, very appalled by the fact that we might observe that it would be very difficult to put everybody at work. And all what has been done in Europe, not in the US, but all what has been done in Europe is based upon preserving the firms, preserving the productive sector through the so-called Kurzarbeit, temporary unemployment, which has been generalized in Europe in order to be sure that we restart as soon as possible, as well as possible. Of course, like Anne, I would hope that everybody has a job and a well-paid job, and then the economy restarts, and as she said, we can pay for the crisis. But again, it would be very difficult, obviously, very, very hard. Even on the other side of the Atlantic, I expect that it would be even much harder, but because there is not the social safety net that we have in Europe. But all that being said, of course, we have to run our economies and to run globalization or mondialization, if you prefer another word, but we have to run it in a different fashion. I fully agree with that. And we cannot pile up debt on debt on debt as we did since the last crisis.
So if we can't do that, what do we do instead? More taxes?
Again, more production, and I would say healthy management of our economies, because all this is good. The wealthiest country of the world are spending a lot in terms of budget. The UK, Europe, the US, enormous amount of money. And part of this money will come from the poorest country or the emerging countries of the world. Because, again, we try to protect ourselves against this crisis, but we count on others to help us. That should be the reverse, of course. The wealthiest country of the world should help the other countries that are less wealthy. It's not what we are doing today. And it is something which we all have to reflect upon, because I am praising what is done, of course, in Europe, and which is trillions of euros to protect us again, our fellow citizens, against the crisis. But how will we finance that? Part of it will come from the poorest country of the world. So let's not forget that.
All right, to prevent it from coming off the backs of the poorest countries in the world, Yanis Varoufakis, again, how do you pay for the recovery?
Well, before we can fix the rest of the world, we need to fix Europe. And Europe is at an advanced stage of disintegration as we speak. The category error that we made back in 2010, and maybe here I can agree with maybe we can agree with Jean-Claude Trichet, is that since 2010, beginning with the Greek bankruptcy, the bankruptcy of the Greek state, we've had a perpetual fraudulent bankruptcy concealment, that the European Union has gone out of its way to pretend that banks and states were not bankrupt when they were, and to simply extend and pretend those bankruptcies by means of rolling on over their unsustainable debts, while at the fiscal policy level, you had permanently deflationary forces, austerity forces, and the result was that Europe has missed a decade. We had a lost decade before the coronavirus hit. So to your question, how do we pay for it? Well, definitely not through new taxes. Definitely through not cutting the incomes of Europeans, as Anne so brilliantly put it. What we need is a sensible debt restructure. The reason why I lament the fact that Macron, Sanchez, Mitsotakis, and the rest gave up on the Eurobond, and I insist that they did give up on it, and that I insist that what they agreed to do to fund the European Commission is not at all the equivalent of the Eurobond. The reason why I lament that is twofold. Firstly, by not having a Eurobond that restructures debt, it shifts it effectively from the level of the nation state to the European level, therefore shrinking the total amount of debt, not just adding debt to debt. By not doing that, they have ensured two things. Firstly, that next year, the budget deficit of Italy, of Greece, of Spain will be more than 10% of GDP, which means that in 2 years' time, Berlin will insist on greater austerity, right in the countries that need to be recovering faster in order to ameliorate for what is happening. And the second reason why I'm lamenting the end of the Eurobond, and I think definitely this is something that Jean-Claude and Anne would agree, I predict, is that by not having a safe asset in Europe, by not having a common debt instrument in Europe, the euro will never become a competitor to the exorbitant power of the dollar, and therefore Europe will never be able to play the role that it should play, its internationalist role, in favor of Africa, in favor of Asia. Europe is making the same category error today as it made in 2010. Wishful thinking is no substitute for proper policy, and I have no evidence, I see nothing coming from the European Council meetings, from the Eurogroup meetings, giving me any ray of hope that this time they will get it right and they will not indulge in another perpetual fraudulent concealment of sequential bankruptcies.
All right, let me bring in Jean-Claude Trichet. Lots to get through, and unfortunately, we're short on time. First of all, on that, the European Central Bank, could it have more teeth coming out of this crisis, as opposed to the national central banks, which often undermine its ability to go further?
Well, I think the European Central Bank, again, did a lot to protect all Europe, at least the euro area, against the crisis. And all what has been done until now seems to me exactly appropriate. And more might come. That depends very much on the unfolding of this crisis, which is still unfolding under our eyes. Second, on the dollar, again, I agree with Yanis. If we had a political federation like the United States, we would be in a totally different world. The Eurobonds would be natural because we would be a political federation. And it goes without saying that the euro would have a totally different place in the world because we would be a political federation. So I'm calling for a political federation. But it needs, of course, the agreement of all the people of Europe. And as you know, we are not yet mature, it looks like, but nothing prevents us from calling for steps in favor of political federation.
And as this continent,
pardon me?
I was just going to say, as this continent begins to eye deconfinement, we are, I guess if we look at Greece, for instance, we can see some good news and some bad news. The good news is this Monday, beaches reopening there. The bad news is it's going to be a long while before the tourists come back. France 24 went to Santorini and spoke to one hotel owner. Let's take a listen.
Φέτος, δυστυχώς με αυτό που έχει βρει όλο τον κόσμο, είμαστε άδειοι, δεν έχουμε κόσμο. Αυτό που πρέπει να πούμε όμως είναι ότι το νησί δεν έχει ούτε ένα κρούσμα.
So there's his plight. No COVID-19 where he is, but COVID-19 elsewhere basically is killing his business. Yanis Varoufakis, a country that relies so heavily on tourism, what's the plan?
Well, there's no plan. There can't be a plan. When 30% of your GDP relies on tourism and the tourism won't come, it's very difficult to have a plan, let's be honest. I'm a member of the opposition here, but I would not ask the government for not having a plan for something like that. We have the lowest number of deaths from COVID-19 in the European Monetary Union, and this is a great thing for us. But at the same time, I very much fear we're going to have the largest number of people who go hungry the next year or two because of the depth of this crisis. Greece was already on the floor. We never really recovered. Don't listen to what financial commentators tell you. And the worst thing is that, next time this year, as we speak, we're going to have a deficit, a primary deficit of minus 15%. There's no doubt that after Berlin hits its Schwarz-Null, the black zero of its budget, that they will start pushing Brussels to push Greece to have an austerity program to reduce this budget deficit. Our debt to GDP ratio will be 210% minimum. And then what happens when you have a huge austerity wave, just like we had in 2011, 10 years after a long depression? It's going to be a human tragedy.
Before this crisis hit, Ann Pettifor, people were wondering aloud, do we travel too much by airplane? We have this leisure society where perhaps we need to rethink it because of our carbon footprint. Now some adding during the crisis, this is a great chance to change all of that. But when you hear Yanis Varoufakis talk about the pain it will inflict on his country, your thoughts on what the world should look like when it's all over?
So Yanis is absolutely right. But what we need for the world to look better afterwards is to recognize the scale of the coming threat that we face. And here I'm going to praise the European Union. And that is, I'm going to praise in particular the proposal for a Green Deal for Europe. It's wholly inadequate. It's not properly financed, but it has opened up a political window. It's opened up space for us to talk about the work that we have to do to deal with the next crisis, which will be a climate crisis. And that's a huge amount of work that must be done. Well, the tragedy of Europe is that we're relying on the private sector. Mr. Trichet is calling on the private sector to create the jobs. The private sector will never create the jobs. It does not have the capacity. Governments have to step in, invest in alternative energy, transport and land use systems and create jobs for people because of the work that has to be done to deal with the forthcoming crisis. That will generate.
But isn't that already happening? Aren't we seeing more as much now investment in renewable energies as we are in fossil fuels?
No.
I don't understand your problem. The problem, the fact is we're developing these alternative energies. Oil will hopefully move out of the picture very soon. But there's still work to be done. We need flood defenses. We need to change our energy system, our land use system, and our transport systems. We've got to get out of motor cars. We've got to find alternative ways of moving around. And we have to do it very urgently. We know that this crisis has only reduced emissions this year by about 5%. We need to have reduced it by 7.6% to survive the climate breakdown that is coming. Right. That requires a lot of work. It needs a lot of people to have jobs and to be paid incomes so that their tax revenues can pay for the recovery. Not raising taxes, because I'm against raising taxes, but raising employment so that will generate the tax revenue to pay for the recovery. And we've got to work to protect ourselves from the forthcoming climate crisis.
In the European Union, we need 600 billion a year to be spent on a green energy union. We're nowhere near that. Nowhere near. We need 5% of GDP, and it's ridiculous for France to have its own electricity network, and system. Germany its own, Greece its own, Italy its own. This is the area where we need to have an energy union, a renewable energy, which is financed by means of a common safe asset that we should have before we have federation, Jean-Claude. Because if we wait for federation, there will be no planet left for us.
I fully agree that we should do more in Europe, but you will recognize with me that the rest of the world counts. There is only one planet. What about the rest of the world? And we should be in that domain also, not only in the virus medicine, leaders, because there is no other leader.
If Europe doesn't take the lead, who is going to take the lead?
Let's be unsatisfied with what we presently are doing, but nevertheless, let's praise Europe to try to be the leader.
I'm not going to praise Europe. I'm not going to praise Europe until Europe does that which it can and it should. I will praise Europe, Jean-Claude, when we commit 600 billion every year, right, to a green energy union. When we do that, I will applaud. I think we have a moral duty not to applaud those who speak the big words about the Green Deal, 1 trillion, and when you look at the details of the financing, there is 20 billion in there. I'm not going to praise them until they actually match
I disagree
with the reality.
I disagree on the figures, obviously. But that being said, we have to do more, and the rest of the world has to do even much more. And that is the reality.
But
as a European,
final word, Ann Pettifor, because we're short on time.
As a European, I'm going to call to checks and balances European leaders. Before I turn to the Americans and to the Chinese, we have a duty to make sure that we match our propaganda with our practice, and we are not doing it. And it's not a question of different interpretations of money. The money is not there. It's smoke and mirrors, the 1 trillion in the Green Deal, in exactly the same way that the 1.5 trillion that they are talking about, the recovery fund, is also smoke and mirrors. When it's
one last word from you. Ann Pettifor.
Yanis is right. And Jean-Claude is also right that we need international coordination. But first of all, we need political leadership. And Yanis is right. We've failed the political leadership role in Europe. And we have to create it. And the only way to create it is to create the economic system which bolsters that leadership. Currently, the economic system diverges Europe, makes it diverge, not converge. And that's the flaw that we have to look at.
All right, we will continue to talk about it. I want to thank you so much, Ann Pettifor, for joining us from Suffolk in England. I want to thank Yanis Varoufakis for being with us just outside of Athens, Jean-Claude Trichet in Paris. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. By the way, programming note, on Wednesday, we're going to be having a Facebook Live at 6 p.m. Paris time with virologist Dr. Albert Osterhaus will be joining us from Hanover. So do join us for that. Thank you in any case for being with us here for the show today. If you missed part of it, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and there's more on France24.com.
Take a new look at the news. Eyewitness accounts from those at the heart of the action, all over the world. Exclusive videos you've never seen before, all verified by our journalists.
The Observers, presented by Derek Thompson on France 24 and France24.com.